Peter Hadfield and shoddy mathematics. Potholer-54, aka Peter Hadfield, is a journalist who plays a YouTube scientist and advocates for anthropological global warming. There are many videos on the internet showing Potholer-54's inability to even grasp basic concepts that he gleefully uses in his videos to create a climate change scare. Let us review one of the Potholer-54's most recent bizarre knowledge of mathematics and feedback systems. Because Potholer-54 has this unique habit of changing his argument again and again, as his use of frivolous terms is caught even by the people with an average IQ above room temperature in degrees Celsius, let's be generous and only cite Peter's most recent video. In his response to Tony Heller, aka Steve Goddard, Potholer-54 talked about his thesis of positive feedback that led to interglacial cycles in the past. Let's take a look at his most recent video and get his most recent attempt at face save. This is the thesis from the Potholer-54's own mouth, or rather, his own hand.
Sober, feel emotions drifting to the middle of the night. I will watch you stumbling around the streets until you realize.
Here you can see Potholer-54 saying with his own mouth about existence of a positive feedback that gets weaker and weaker with time. Let us look at a positive feedback system. The output of this system is obviously temperature, and the input is insolation or changes in orbital cycle. Also, the product of A and B must be less than unity, as Potholer-54 himself says. Understanding Potholer-54's system, let us look at his thesis in more detail. In an earlier video, Potholer-54 gives this example of how small changes in temperature initially cause large change in temperature on Earth. Watch.
In my video, The Ice Age, I said there was a trigger that set off a vicious circle of events, each tipping the Earth into a cooling or a warming phase. In scientific terms, the vicious circle is called positive feedback, and it's best explained by looking at some weights on a balanced plank. If the weights are equidistant from the pivot point, the plank is in balance. A slight offset will tilt the plank, but it won't upset the balance. But let's say one of the weights is round and is moved half an inch. This causes the plank to tilt slightly. But the tilt causes the weight to roll a bit, and the shift in position causes the plank to tilt a bit more, until soon there's a runaway event and the plank comes crashing to the ground. We know that similar positive feedback happened during the ice ages. Each cooling and warming phase is amplified, so that a tiny bit of cooling ends up freezing half the planet, and a tiny bit of warming ends up thawing it out again.
However, in his most recent video, Potholer-54 backs down on that example and begins pointing difference between that example and his actual global warming thesis. Watch.
He seems to be mixing up two completely different things. I used this very simple illustration in one of my videos to explain the principle of positive feedback, using the example of a balance with a rolling weight. In this example, positive feedback brings the plank crashing to the ground because the feedback is greater than 1. In other words, even after the initial forcing stops, the tilting continues and accelerates. In the example of feedback in glacial cycles, I explained that once the initial forcing stops, positive feedback doesn't get faster and faster and lead to runaway warming because feedback is less than 1. I can list the differences very clearly in this graphic, so hopefully they won't get mixed up again in Tony's next rebuttal.
If indeed the climate change according to Potholer-54 does not occur, how the weights on a balanced plank work, why did he give that example, including the point about the plank crashing on the ground? So Potholer-54 in one of his earlier videos, immediately after giving example of a plank crashing down, said that similar positive feedback happened during the ice ages.
But the tilt causes the weight to roll a bit, and the shift in position causes the plank to tilt a bit more, until soon there's a runaway event and the plank comes crashing to the ground. We know that similar positive feedback happened during the ice ages. A runaway event and the plank comes crashing to the ground. We know that similar positive feedback happened during the Ice Ages.
In his most recent video, that similar positive feedback is in no way similar. His new example is that of an echo that bounces around a canyon. Before Potholer-54 again changes this example to something else, let us review it. Potholer-54 says that the effect of feedback gets less and less over time, and that is because the climate feedback value is less than 1. But Potholer-54 says something else too. He says that the initial input stops after some time. Here you can find a reference for that. So the positive feedback system of Potholer-54 actually looks like this. Apparently, Potholer-54 also does not know the definition of positive feedback. Someone should ask Potholer-54 that if there is no input at all, how can the feedback be in phase with the input? Let us again humor the wannabe scientist and the messiah of the climate change alarmists. This is Potholer-54's new positive feedback system after some time. Potholer-54 says that the feedback effect is less than unity in this system. This means that AB is less than 1. Considering that the new output under this system is a product of old output and AB is less than 1, this is actually a system with decreasing output. If Potholer-54 knew basic maths, he would realize that this system is not actually a positive feedback system, and so the positive feedback equation does not apply. This is what the graph of this system would look like, assuming AB is less than 1. But this is not where the story ends. Let us give the benefit of doubt to Potholer-54 considering that he is a journalist and that his audience is comprised of a bunch of illiterates. Let us assume that the input still exists. In that case, we will have a stable output as Potholer-54 needs for his theory to be correct. But this is not how the graph of interglacial cycle that is shared by Potholer-54 himself looks. Look at all the warming slopes in the graph closely. The first slope has periods of constant temperature, while in the graph they may look small but they represent thousands of years. For supposedly thousands of years, we see this positive feedback stopping entirely. For other slopes of warming temperature, we see graphs with weird behavior. Instead of seeing graphs with a continuously decreasing slope that tends to zero, we see graphs with sudden change in slope, kinks, and peaks. The only thing consistent in the two graphs is an increasing slope. This is how the warming section should look like. Now let us look at Potholer-54's echo example. If we consider temperature to be like echo in Potholer-54's example, then just like echo decreases with time, so would the temperature, completely destroying Potholer-54's thesis. If we consider, as Potholer-54 says, that echo actually is not akin to temperature in his example but an addition to temperature that gets successfully reduced every time, then the actual model would look something like this. Well, in theory, this system could be convergent. This is not a positive feedback system. Hence, if this system actually exists, it poses no climatic threat, destroying Potholer-54's climate alarmism. But for Peter Hadfield's followers, that is not important. Even forgetting Potholer-54's unethical behavior, his about 3,200 fans still don't know that there is no positive feedback system without an input. Apparently, before ushering in scientism, they should have had learned what feedback systems are, or even basic mathematics. But that is hard. Saying that you stand for science ad nauseum is easy. However, that should not make people who are not utterly stupid fall into the shoddy science of climate alarmism. They does not even know what feedback systems are.